It's a whole year since The Witcher's Familiar first aired. Watch on to find out why I love it so much. So episode 2, The Witcher's Familiar. Now I'd just like to say briefly, if you've not seen my first review yet, that is the review of The Magician's Apprentice, please go and watch that now, because the chances are I'm going to be referring back to that episode and the points I made about that episode in this review, because it is a two-parter after all. So please go and watch that if you haven't already. Otherwise, let's go on to The Witcher's Familiar. So the opening scene, it doesn't follow on from the cliffhanger like you'd expect. I can't really think of many examples of this that we've seen before. The Series 5 finale kind of springs to mind. Obviously, we're left with the Doctor and the Pandorica, and then we go to Amelia Pond or something. But I like it, actually. I like how the cliffhanger isn't resolved just yet, how it's left waiting. And I'll talk about the significance of this more later on. But just focusing on the first scene itself, it's a unique scene, and it kind of serves two purposes. The first is for the wider audience, the ones that were tuning in last week, to reveal how Missy and Clara survived being exterminated by Daleks. But then there's also this kind of second layer for the fans that saw Series 8 last year, and the more regular viewers, to explain how Missy survived in Death in Heaven. And I love the way this is done, because it kind of ties these two things together and makes them one, and it explains them as one. So the kind of wider audience doesn't feel alienated, because Missy didn't just do it in last year's finale, she also did it just last week as well, if you get what I'm talking about. It's the same method of surviving being shot at. And I just love how this scene brings something from Series 8 back up to date, but that's also relevant to Series 9, and explains it in a really kind of quirky way. So I'm a big fan of this scene, even though it doesn't carry on straight from where we left off. I don't know about anybody else, but I thought the titles were a lot more in sync this time. But I'm not an expert, I don't know, I've not looked it up, I don't know if they're exactly in sync, or if there's still a timing issue, but they seem best to me, so that's got a thumbs up from me this time, because last week they were absolutely awful. So we then go to the scenes with the Doctor and Davros. One thing I noticed this time round, on this rewatch, is that on Davros' screens in his hospital kind of room, the round screens are still playing clips from previous Davros and Dalek stories in the background as the Doctor and Davros talk. I thought that only happened in The Magician's Apprentice, you know, right when the Doctor comes in and Davros is showing him them, but it turns out they're actually on in the background as well if you look closely. So, I don't know, maybe Davros was watching them for pleasure and just left them on accidentally. It is a bit weird how he's kind of got all this footage, but there we go. It's a nice touch for the fans, I think. The Doctor stealing Davros' chair is both hilarious, but also somehow quite dark and disturbing, because as others have said before, the Doctor would have had to kind of grab Davros and rip him out of that chair, and he leaves him on the floor down there. It's quite dark, I think, but then there's also the kind of other meaning, the other way of looking at it. It's very, very funny how he just comes out, you know, the door opens and you see Davros' chair, oh, it's Davros. And then it's the Doctor poking his head out. And the following scene as well with the Daleks and the cup of tea, and how he's definitely taking Davros' chair. It's great, and provides a little bit of humour in quite a dark story, really. I think the theory of old Daleks rotting away to create the sewers is unique and very effective. I also think it's clever how the sewers are introduced this early on. You think at this point, oh, Missy and Clara are just using the sewers as a means of getting back into the city, you know, in Skaro. But in actual fact, they crop up again later in the resolution when, you know, the sewers are revolting. And I think that's quite clever and subtle, because as Missy and Clara go through the sewer corridors, you don't really think anything of it, but then it becomes relevant at the end, and it's ever so subtle. I really, really like that aspect of it. Likewise, I enjoy the scenes of Clara inside a Dalek, and the concept of it being the casing, or at least the technology in the casing, that warps her speech and emotions, and the same applies to the Dalek mutants as well. I know this is quite controversial, it kind of contradicts some stuff previously set up in the canon, but I just like it, really. I'm not entirely sure why, but I've always loved what Stephen Moffat has done, or at least tried to do with the Daleks. You know, in stories such as Asylum, even though, yes, Asylum of the Daleks isn't perfect, there are some really interesting concepts about the Daleks in there. The same applies for Into the Dalek as well. It's such an original idea for the Doctor to go inside a Dalek, and it allows some really original, different scenes, different new situations for the Doctor to be in, and learn more about the Daleks, I think, which allows the viewers to learn more about the Daleks as well. So, overall, I do like what Stephen Moffat does with the Daleks. I think his concepts and ideas are very inventive, but maybe that's for a different video. I don't know. But in this story, at least, yeah, I just think it's a good concept, and it makes sense, and yeah, it's just very refreshing and very different. Of course, Clara being inside the Dalek as well, as Missy points out later on in the story, it kind of symbolises the whole theme of the friend inside the enemy and enemy inside the friend, which I find ever so interesting. That running thread throughout these two stories, it's really interesting because you've got the dynamics between Missy and Clara, and to what extent is Missy evil. You've got Davros as well, parallels between Davros and the Doctor. It's very interesting stuff, and of course, Clara being inside the Dalek casing develops this concept and pushes it on forward, and kind of eventually, to be honest, leads to the bit at the end, the coda of the story, where the Doctor shows young Davros mercy. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. I think I should probably hold back, because that's all to come later on. One more thing about that bit, though, is that I really do love how it echoes Asylum of the Daleks, because obviously we saw Clara, or at least one of the Clara splinters, Oswin, inside a Dalek. It's just a nice touch. It doesn't really mean anything, but it's just a nice one for the fans, I think. And I love that line from Missy: Cybermen suppress emotion, Daleks channel it. I probably don't need to explain this too much, because I have gone on about this part of it quite a lot already. But I really like that quote. I think it's brilliant, and it makes you think about the Daleks and the Cybermen and emotions as well. Michelle Gomez's portrayal of the Master seems to be much more kind of naturally and believably bonkers, I think, than Sims, because at times with Sims Master, more so in the Series 3 finale, I think, you just felt he was being completely insane for the sake of it, if you get what I mean. I know he had the drums in his head, but at times I didn't really believe his insanity. But with Missy, because it's so on and off, and you're never quite sure what she's going to do, she's so unpredictable, and I enjoy that more than John Sims Master going off and shouting and trying to be really melodramatically evil. I much prefer it when it's toned down with Missy, and then suddenly it comes out of nowhere. And because it comes out of nowhere, and she's so unpredictable, I find it even more scary when she loses it. I think particularly at the end, I'm getting ahead of myself again, but the scene where she tries to make the Doctor leave Clara in the Dalek casing is ever so dark. And I think it's probably Missy's darkest moment, that's this incarnation of the Master, because it's just so downright evil. She would be perfectly happy to leave Clara there, in the Dalek casing, while old Daleks from the sewers are revolting, all just to make the Doctor notice her more, and kind of recover their friendship. And I think that's what makes Missy such a layered, interesting character. The scenes between Capaldi and Julian Bleach are sublime. Some of the best scenes of the series, and some of the best Dr. Davros scenes as well, because they pinpoint the debates they've been having for years, and it feels like they're kind of going somewhere with it. Instead of shouting at each other about whether Davros should have created the Daleks, their conversations here feel more deep, more kind of relatable, and they seem to find more common ground as well. There are loads of parallels between them that are made clear in this story. And this culminates in scenes such as Davros congratulating the Doctor for finding Gallifrey and opening his eyes. I think Davros opening his real eyes is a beautiful, genius moment. I know some people don't like it. I mean, I for one wasn't sure if they were empty eye sockets or actual eyelids. I didn't really realise they were eyelids until this point. But I can deal with that, you know. It doesn't really massively change the canon or anything established so far. And I think it makes perfect sense for Davros to be able to open his eyes for one last time, given that he's been using the third blue eye for so long. I know he's meant to have that because his other eyes don't work, but I think it's just irresistible to have that human connection with Davros, to see his eyes and to see him crying. Because obviously quite a creepy thought is that those eyes are, well, supposedly, the same as young Davros's eyes. It's the only kind of part of Davros that has remained constant throughout his life. And I think the Doctor notices that and sees more of young Davros in Davros at this point, and that's kind of what makes him go ahead with the plan and the regeneration energy and all that kind of stuff. Of course, there's a massive debate about when Davros started and stopped acting. Personally, I think it comes at the point after the eye scene, when he mentions wanting to see the sun again with his own eyes, because that sounds more sly than the rest of it. I think he either got really carried away in the other scenes, or maybe he had second thoughts about his plan and then changed his mind back again at the last minute, because the eyes scene in particular just seems so genuine. And I don't think Moffat would deliberately undermine all the scenes with Doctor and Davros just because of Davros's plan. Clearly Davros has had the plan for a long time, because he mentions to Colin Sarf quite early on about luring the Time Lord back, but then it's not mentioned again for a while. So, I don't know, yeah, does Davros get carried away, or does he kind of get cold feet about what he's going to do? I don't know, but it's an interesting debate, because obviously it's not made clear on screen from which point Davros stops acting. One interesting line that I noticed on this rewatch is, little bit of regeneration energy may cost me an arm or a leg somewhere down the line, or maybe next time I'll just be really little. Given that, I really hope, just for irony if nothing else, that next Doctor is really short. It would just be really funny and ironic, because obviously he said it in this episode, and it would be kind of coincidental foreshadowing in a way. An interesting parallel I drew between the Doctor and Davros is that both their plans are very clever, I think. There's Davros's plan to lure the Doctor there, but then kind of go off tangent a bit, try and persuade him to help him before actually kind of forcing him and trapping him. But then there's the Doctor's plan as well. It's sort of double bluffing, because the Doctor had his plan in his head all along, just like Davros did, but just didn't mention it, which is exactly what Davros did. So that's an interesting parallel that I found between the two characters. Obviously there are lots of parallels between them in this two-parter, but I think that's a particularly interesting one, because they're both quite devious and calculating, I think. Not necessarily in an evil way, but that's just the way they are. They have these secret plans in their heads that they kind of seemingly take out at the last minute. One thing that, looking back, I feel really stupid about is ever believing that the hybrid would be half Time Lord, half Dalek, because it's so obvious. I noticed on this rewatch that, well, basically, we've seen Dalek and Time Lord hybrids already. I mean, first of all, you've got to remember that Davros's suggestion about it being half Dalek, half Time Lord, I don't think that was intended to kind of be set up as the thing for the series. You know, for that to be the definitive description of the hybrid, of what it is, and then for us to get all these different tangents, like Maisie Williams, throughout the series, and then go back to that in the finale. I don't think that was ever the intention. I think, well, I know, the half Dalek, half Time Lord thing, that was never going to be the hybrid. That was just another suggestion from Davros. Because, like I say, we see it here. We see the Daleks with the CGI regeneration energy, the orange glowy stuff around their domes, and then, well, basically, in that penultimate scene, they become half Time Lord, half Dalek hybrids, as do the Daleks in the sewers. So I think, kind of collectively, as a fan base, it was really stupid to assume that we'd ever be seeing a Dalek Time Lord hybrid, because that's exactly what we get here. I don't know if people were kind of expecting to see something more graphic, something a bit different, but looking back, it's just so obvious that we weren't going to see it again, because it's right here, staring us in the face. I will just say that overall, I love the hybrid story arc, which I will talk about more as this series of videos goes on, but I think to kind of start the ball rolling right now, really, that's an interesting thing to bear in mind if you don't like that story arc. I think the first step to understand it more is to kind of recognise and acknowledge that the hybrid was never going to be half Dalek, half Time Lord, and then kind of see where that leaves you. Another thing that I picked up on this rewatch is the double meaning of the sewers are revolting. Well, I say I picked it up on this rewatch. I didn't. I picked it up on the first watch, you know, the kind of double meaning of it, A, being the sewers revolting as in rebelling, but also the sewers being revolting because they smell and they're stinky. But that's a kind of hybrid in itself. I don't know if that's intentional or not. With lots of these things, you kind of never know. But I just found that quite interesting, that the double meaning of that phrase is a hybrid in itself. I think I've really explained as much as I can why Missy is so evil in the penultimate scene, so I won't bore you with that explanation again. But it's interesting how it links back to the woman in the shop, with Missy claiming that she gave the Dr. Clara all along to show him that everyone's a bit of both, that being the friend and the enemy. Does that work? I don't know. I suppose if you consider Asylum of the Daleks, where Clara or Oswin is a Dalek at first, you know, that's the first time we see a splinter of Clara, and she is the friend inside the enemy then then it kind of works. But Clara hasn't been a friend inside the enemy again up until this point. It's probably more likely that Missy was referring to herself being an enemy, but still giving the Doctor Clara as a present, as it were, because she is his friend. But that's an interesting one to think about, how it links back, and if it works. I think it kind of sort of does, but you just have to kind of think about it a little bit. I do love how the ending sets up a possible Missy-Dalek alliance for Series 10. I think if that's never paid off, then it'll be a real missed opportunity. Obviously, we've got Missy, a fantastic character. We've only actually seen her in 4 episodes, if you discount all of the cameo appearances throughout Series 8. And as I've said already, I'm a big fan of Michelle Gomez's portrayal of the Master, and it would be a real shame to not see her again in Series 10. On the other hand as well, we've got the Daleks, a massive Dalek empire. I don't think Missy would be prepared to team up with Davros, but definitely with that massive Dalek empire. There's a lot of potential there, 2 very dangerous sides joining together to create an unstoppable alliance. Maybe something for the Series 10 finale, or even Moffat's final episode of the Christmas special in 2017. I don't know. But just as long as it's paid off, and it's paid off well, I'll be happy. Just to finish, I want to go back to something I mentioned at the start about the cliffhanger. Now, some people might feel a bit disappointed that the cliffhanger from The Magician's Apprentice wasn't paid off right up until the end of this story. But I have quite a different opinion on that, really. I think one thing you've got to remember is that scene doesn't naturally come at the end of The Magician's Apprentice in the first place. From the Doctor's point of view, it's from the end of his story and, the end of The Witch's Familiar. It's only really there for effect, I think, to kind of make you think for a split second that the Doctor will really shoot Davros because of what he's done. And in that way, it's a bit misleading. But I sort of approve of it being there in The Magician's Apprentice, just to tie all the action from Skaro back down to the young Davros situation that the episode started with. And in the same way, I like how it's resolved right at the end of this story, because it turns it into a kind of coda. The whole thing with the Doctor showing Davros mercy, that's a kind of coda to the story as a whole, really. And I suppose having that cliffhanger in the middle of the story makes you question whether the Doctor will shoot Davros or not, whether he's a good man, whether he's a friend or an enemy. But right at the end of the story, it's resolved, and he shows him mercy. And there's that beautiful shot of the two of them holding hands, just walking across the battlefield at the end. And I can't emphasise enough how much that is the icing on the cake for me. You get to the end of this viewing, 2 parts, 2 weeks worth of stuff about friends and enemies, and then you're presented with this lovely scene at the end, just to top it all off, and make that point about mercy, and conclude that theme really, and the story itself. So to be honest, on rewatch, I found The Witch's Familiar just as good as on previous watches, if not better. Overall, this 2-parter just works so well for me. I think it's the underlying theme of friends and enemies, and then how it's just topped off at the end. And I can't really put it into words, to be perfectly honest, but I just love it so much. I guess I love how it plays around with the morals, and as I said a little bit earlier, how it makes you question the characters, explore the characters. Is Missy a friend or an enemy? Is the Doctor a good man or an enemy or a friend or whatever? Was Davros right to create the Daleks, or is he just evil? So overall, there's a lot to think about in this 2-parter. It's very thought-provoking, I think. Like quite a few episodes in Series 9. You probably know what I'm talking about, the stuff later on in the series, the Zygon 2-parter, Heaven Sent. But obviously I will touch upon that later in this series of reviews. So that's what I think of The Witch's Familiar, but what do you guys think? My first comment today is from Charlie, who says, a considerable improvement on part 1, but still flawed, especially the whole Dalek casing filter thing. I've kind of mentioned already why I like that, but like I say, I can see why people might not. And yeah, I guess it's just a case of taste, really. But I do agree it's much better than The Witch's Familiar, and definitely the stronger part out of the 2. Rebel Whovian says, I thought that the story didn't really get going until a third of the way through the episode, and I thought the next time trailer was a bit misleading. I'm not sure I agree with this, really. I know lots of people said last week that The Magician's Apprentice took a while to get going, but I think there's definitely more going on in The Witch's Familiar. You've got Davros and the Doctor stealing his chair, and that's obviously very funny. You've got the subplot with Missy and Clara trying to get back into the city, and then Clara going inside the Dalek, and all the consequences that follow after that. I don't think I'd say the next time trailer is misleading either, although there is quite a bit of stuff from the pre-titles with the Doctor in that hypothetical situation. And yeah, I can kind of see why putting that in the trailer might not have been the best idea in hindsight, because it does kind of set up something that doesn't really even happen. It's basically just Missy saying, consider the Doctor doing this, he had a teleport, and that's how we escaped the Dalek control room. Billy Howe says, I enjoyed seeing Davros again, however, the episode wasn't that good in my opinion, too much fan service, there was no proper explanation for Skaro still being a planet, and no explanation to why they were random classic Daleks, etc. While I do agree with you kind of, I think the way this story deals with the return of Skaro, as opposed to Asylum of the Daleks, which is just dismal in how it brings back Skaro, I think this episode definitely does it a lot better, because there's at least some explanation saying how they just brought it back. But yeah, I can kind of see where you're coming from with that point. I sort of agree about the Daleks. I will admit they are kind of fan service a little bit. But I also agree with Stephen Moffat's point from Doctor Who Extra that if you were to go to Skaro, you wouldn't see one type of Dalek, you'd see lots of different designs, you know, veteran Daleks if you like, from all across history, from all their old battles, you know, war heroes, the Daleks that survived and are now commanding patrols and things. So I actually quite like the inclusion of the classic Daleks. But yeah, again, I can see why some people don't. And my final comment for today is from Isaac Dakin, who says, it's the stronger part and full of great moments, like the Doctor being in Davros' chair, and the Doctor and Davros' conversation about compassion is excellent. I totally agree with this. I think that the scene with the Doctor and Davros' chair is very original, very funny, in quite a dark episode really. And then the revelation that Colony Star snakes are in there as well. I think that's genius, very clever. And then also the scenes with Doctor and Davros. What more do I need to say? I've mentioned it already in this video. I know lots of people agree with me. You know, I don't think there's anybody really in the fandom that doesn't like those Doctor and Davros scenes. They're absolutely brilliant, and probably the best we've ever had between those two characters. So thank you for watching this retrospective review. I hope you're enjoying Defending Series 9, and just like last week, please comment your opinions on The Witch is Familiar, and also let me know if I've changed your opinions on it, giving you a new perspective, because that is the aim of this series. Please also comment your thoughts on Under the Lake, or tweet them to me, so I can feature them in the next Defending Series 9 video, which will be coming next Monday. So thank you very much for watching again, and bye for now.